Tonight, I invite you to a narrow, cobbled street in the old city of York, where the fog drifts softly between the buildings and a single candle glows in the window of a small shop. It is the workshop of a candlemaker, a place filled with the scent of warm wax, gentle light, and the quiet weight of passing years. But on one of the shelves, there is a candle that always burns a little longer than the rest, and each evening, the old candlemaker notices it, yet never blows it out. Before the story begins, stay here with me for just a moment. Watch the soft flicker of the flame and let this quiet workshop carry you slowly toward sleep. Part 1. The Candlemaker's Window. The fog came early to York that morning, as it so often did in the weeks before Christmas, settling upon the ancient streets like a soft woolen blanket drawn up by invisible hands. It crept along the worn cobblestones of Stonegate, curling around the corners of timber-framed buildings that had stood sentinel for 300 years or more, their upper stories leaning companionably toward one another across the narrow thoroughfare, as though sharing whispered confidences in the gray dawn. In the stillness before the city properly woke, before the clatter of cartwheels and the calls of merchants broke the silence, there was only the muffled sound of footsteps here and there, a baker making his way to his ovens, a lamplighter completing his rounds, extinguishing the gas lamps one by one, as the pale winter light began its slow ascent behind the cathedral towers. And there, halfway down the street, in a building no wider than 2 windows and a door, a single point of golden light pierced the fog. It glowed steadily in the window of a small shop, warm and constant, as though it had been burning all through the night. The light caught the frost that had formed on the outside of the glass, transforming each crystalline pattern into something precious and delicate. It illuminated the painted lettering above the door, letters that had faded somewhat over the years, but could still be read by those who knew to look. Halbrook and Son, Chandlers, established 1823. The and Son had not been true for many years now. Inside the shop, the air was thick with the sweet honeyed scent of beeswax mingled with the faint smokiness of tallow and the clean sharpness of new cotton wick. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and upon those shelves stood candles of every conceivable size and shape. Tall tapers for dining tables stood like soldiers in their wooden boxes. Squat, sturdy candles for lanterns nestled in rows. Delicate votives, no bigger than a thimble, weighted in paper wrappings. And larger pillar candles, substantial and serious, occupied the middle shelves with an air of quiet dignity. The single candle that had been burning through the night stood upon the counter near the window, its flame steady and unwavering, despite the drafts that found their way through the old building's many cracks and crevices. It was not an especially large candle, nor was it particularly ornate. It was made of good beeswax, pale gold in color, with a simplicity of form that spoke more eloquently than any decoration might have done. As the church bells of York Minster began to toll 6 o'clock, their deep voices rolling across the rooftops and chimney pots, a door at the back of the shop opened, and an elderly man emerged into the golden half-light of the workshop. Mr. Edwin Halbrook moved slowly, as befitted a man in his 73rd year, but there was nothing feeble in his movements. He carried himself with the careful precision of one who had spent a lifetime working with hot wax and open flame, where haste could mean burnt fingers or ruined work. His hair, what remained of it, formed a silver halo around his head in the candlelight. He wore a wool waistcoat over his shirt and an apron, much mended and bearing the stains of countless candles, was already tied about his waist, for he had put it on before even making his tea, as was his habit. He paused for a moment in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness, though he knew every inch of this room as well as he knew the lines of his own hands. Then he moved forward into the shop with the quiet confidence of long familiarity. His first task, as it had been for more years than he cared to count, was to unlock the front door. Not to open it, that would come later, when the fog had lifted somewhat and the street had fully awakened, but simply to unlock it. It was a ritual, a way of telling himself that the day had begun, that the night's solitude had ended, and that the world, with all its small necessities and gentle rhythms, was ready to receive him once more. The key turned in the lock with a soft click that seemed loud in the morning quiet. Mr. Halbrook returned to the counter and began the work that had shaped his days for as long as he could remember. He took up a small pair of scissors, their handles worn smooth by decades of use, and began trimming the wicks of the candles that would burn in the shop that day. Each wick required attention. Too long, and the candle would smoke and sputter. Too short, and the flame would drown in melted wax. It was a small thing, this trimming, but Mr. Halbrook had long ago learned that the world was built of small things done with care. Snip, snip, snip. The sound was rhythmic and soothing, punctuated only by the gentle settling of the building around him and the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the fog. He worked his way along the counter, then to the shelves, lighting candles as he went. Not all of them, that would have been wasteful. And Mr. Halbrook was not a wasteful man, but enough to fill the shop with a warm, welcoming glow. He used a long taper for the purpose, lighting it from the candle on the counter and then carrying the flame carefully from wick to wick. As each new candle caught and bloomed into light, the shop transformed. Shadows retreated into the corners. The grain of the wooden shelves became visible, rich and warm. The brass scales on the counter gleamed softly. And in the window, the candles arranged for display began to glow like a constellation of small earthbound stars. Mr. Halbrook stepped back to survey his work, as he always did, ensuring that the shop looked as it should. His eyes traveled across the familiar landscape of shelves and stock, of tools and materials, of the accumulated evidence of a life spent in quiet making. And then, as his gaze reached the highest shelf on the wall behind the counter, he paused. There, slightly apart from the others, stood a single candle. It was not the largest candle in the shop, nor the most beautiful, though it possessed a beauty of its own, a simple, unadorned pillar of pale beeswax that seemed to hold the light with interest. Mr. Halbrook could not have said with certainty how long that particular candle had been there. Years, certainly, perhaps a decade or more. What he could say, what he had noticed, season after season, year after year, was that it burned longer than any candle had a right to burn. He had lit it, of course, many times. When the shop grew particularly cold, or when he worked late into the evening and needed the company of light, and it burned as any candle would burn, with a steady golden flame. But it never seemed to diminish, or if it did diminish, it did so with such exceeding slowness that the change escaped notice. The candle stood at the same height, maintained the same dignity of form year after year, as though time itself had agreed to pass it by. Mr. Halbrook did not dwell on this mystery overmuch. He was not a fanciful man. The world, in his experience, contained enough genuine wonder in the way light moved through wax, in the precise moment when liquid became solid, in the mathematics of wick and flame, that he felt no need to invent more. If the candle burned longer than seemed natural, well, perhaps he had made it especially well. Perhaps the wax had been particularly pure, the wick particularly true, or perhaps, and here a small smile touched his lips, perhaps some mysteries were content to remain mysterious, and that was perfectly acceptable. He turned away from the high shelf and moved to the small window at the back of his shop, drawing aside the curtain to look out into the yard beyond. The fog was beginning to thin, just slightly, and he could make out the shapes of the neighboring buildings, the dark line of the wall that separated one property from another, the bare branches of the tree that grew in Mrs. Pemberton's garden next door. It would be a quiet day, he suspected. The fog would keep many people at home. But there would be visitors, nonetheless. There always were. Someone would need candles for their church. Someone else would want a good light for reading. Perhaps young Thomas from the bookshop would come by for the tapers he preferred for his late-night studying. Mr. Halbrook returned to the front of the shop and settled himself on the tall stool behind the counter. He had an hour, perhaps, before anyone would knock at the door. Time enough for a cup of tea. Time enough to watch the morning light strengthen. Time enough to simply sit in the company of candlelight and silence, two things of which he had never grown tired. The candle on the counter continued to burn, its flame painting slow, wandering shadows on the ceiling above. Outside, York was waking. Somewhere, a door opened and closed. Voices called out greetings. The city was remembering itself, shaking off the night's dreams, preparing for the day's work. But here, in the small shop on Stonegate, time moved differently. Here, the day began as it always had, with light chasing back darkness, with small rituals performed with care, with the quiet knowledge that some things, warmth, welcome, the steady burning of a good candle, remained constant in a world much given to change. Mr. Halbrook drew a breath, feeling the warmth of the shop settle around him like an embrace. Outside, the fog would lift. Customers would come, work would be done. But for now, in this moment, there was only the gentle glow of candlelight, the sweet smell of beeswax, and the peaceful certainty of another day beginning as it should. The candle on the high shelf, the one that burned longer than it ought, remained where it had always been, keeping its quiet vigil, holding its small mystery close. And in the window, the golden light continued to shine, a beacon for anyone who might be walking through the fog, a promise of warmth and welcome in the gray December morning. Part 2. Wax, Wick, and Quiet Hands. The morning tea had been drunk, the cup rinsed and set aside, and now Mr. Halbrook turned his attention to the work that would occupy the greater part of his day. In the room behind the shop, a space that served as both workshop and storeroom, the tools of his trade awaited him with the patient silence of inanimate things that know they will be needed. He moved through the narrow doorway, ducking his head slightly, though the passage was tall enough, a habit formed over long years when his back had been straighter and the world a fraction larger. The workshop was smaller than the shop itself, but it possessed a completeness that the front room lacked. Here was where the true work happened, where formless wax became light, where the alchemy of his craft transformed simple materials into something useful and good. The table that dominated the center of the room bore the marks of decades of labor. Its surface was scarred and stained, darkened in places where hot wax had spilled and cooled, lighter in others where his hands had worn the wood smooth through endless repetition. Along one wall stood shelves holding blocks of beeswax, their surfaces dull gold in the dim light. Beside them, wrapped in cloth, were stores of tallow, less expensive, less fragrant, but necessary nonetheless for those customers whose purses could not stretch to beeswax. Mr. Halbrook ran his hand along the edge of the table, a gesture of greeting, of acknowledgement. Then he set about preparing his workspace with the methodical care that had become second nature. First, the fire. The small stove in the corner needed tending, its embers from the night before stirred to life and fed with carefully chosen pieces of coal. Not too much. The heat must be steady and even, not fierce. Wax was a delicate thing, for all its seeming solidity. Too much heat, and it would scorch, turning bitter and dark. Too little, and it would never properly melt, remaining thick and unworkable. He worked the bellows gently, coaxing the fire to a steady glow. The warmth began to spread through the small room, chasing away the morning chill that had settled in the corners. Mr. Halbrook could feel it on his face, on his hands, a warmth that spoke of work about to begin, of purpose about to be fulfilled. While the stove heated, he selected the wax he would work with today. His hands moved over the blocks with assurance, choosing 3, all beeswax, for he had an order to fill for the cathedral, and they would accept nothing less. The wax was cool and firm beneath his fingers, its surface slightly rough. He could smell it even before heating, that characteristic scent of honey and summer meadows, of flowers and industry, and the patient work of bees. He broke the blocks into smaller pieces using a broad-bladed knife, the wax fracturing along natural lines with satisfying cracks. The pieces went into a large copper pot, one that his father had used, and his father's father before that. The pot was burnished to a soft glow, its bottom darkened by years of heat, its handle wrapped in leather that had molded itself to the shape of hands, now long since. Still, Mr. Halbrook set the pot on the stove and watched as the wax began its transformation. It happened slowly, as all good things do. At first, nothing seemed to change. The pieces of wax sat in the pot, apparently impervious to the heat below. But if one watched closely, and Mr. Halbrook always watched closely, one could see the moment when the wax began to surrender. A faint sheen appeared on the surface of the pieces. The edges softened, grew rounded, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, the solid began to flow. It melted from the bottom up, turning liquid gold, pooling in the base of the pot, and slowly climbing the sides of the pieces that remained solid. Mr. Halbrook stirred gently with a wooden paddle, helping the process along, watching as piece after piece yielded to the heat and became part of the whole. The smell intensified as the wax melted, sweet and warm and infinitely comforting, filling the workshop and seeping through into the shop beyond. It was the smell of his childhood, of watching his father work, of learning that patience and attention were worth more than haste and force. It was the smell of countless quiet mornings, just like this, one of work done well, of craft practiced with care. When the wax was fully melted, Mr. Halbrook removed the pot from direct heat and set it on a trivet to cool slightly. Wax that was too hot would not hold a wick properly, would burn the cotton and make for a poor candle. It needed to cool to just the right temperature, hot enough to coat and penetrate, cool enough to begin setting almost immediately. While he waited, he prepared the wicks. They hung in bundles from hooks on the wall, long strands of braided cotton, clean and white and ready. Mr. Halbrook took down a bundle and cut it into lengths appropriate for the tapers he would make today. Each cut was measured not with a rule, but with his eye, an eye that had made this judgment so many thousands of times that it no longer required conscious thought. His hands simply knew. He arranged the cut wicks on the table, laying them out parallel to one another, straight and neat. Disorder in the beginning led to disorder in the end. And Mr. Halbrook had no patience for disorder, not from irritation. He was not an irritable man, but from the simple understanding that his craft deserved better. Outside, the fog had lifted somewhat, and through the high window of the workshop, a pale gray light filtered down. It mingled with the warmer light from the candles he had lit earlier, creating a soft illumination that was neither holy daylight nor holy candlelight, but something in between, a gentle diffused glow that seemed to suit the quiet work of the morning. Mr. Halbrook tested the wax with one finger, pressing lightly against the surface. It was ready. That particular warmth, that particular consistency, these were things he knew in his bones, knowledge accumulated through years of daily practice until it became instinct. He took up the first wick and dipped it into the wax. The process was simple. Lower the wick into the pot, immersing it completely. Lift it out. Wait. The wax that coated the wick would cool and harden, creating a thin layer, then dip again and again and again, layer upon layer, each one adding infinitesimal thickness, each one building toward the final form. Dip, lift, wait, dip, lift, wait. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, meditative. There was no rushing this work. Each layer needed time to cool before the next could be added, or else the accumulated wax would simply slide off, wasted. So, Mr. Halbrook dipped in rotation, working his way through the dozen wicks he had prepared, giving each its turn, returning to the first, just as it was ready for another layer. His hands moved with the unconscious grace of long practice. The wicks dipped and rose, each time emerging a fraction thicker than before, the wax building up in smooth, even layers. Slowly, so slowly that the change was almost imperceptible from moment to moment. Thin string became slender candle. The work left his mind free to wander, though it never wandered far. Memories drifted up like smoke. His father standing at this very table, his hands performing these same motions. His own younger self, learning the craft, impatient at first with the slowness of it, the repetition, gradually coming to understand that the slowness was the point, that the repetition was where the quality lived. He remembered the first candle he had made entirely by himself. How proud he had been, how his father had examined it with serious eyes before nodding once, a single nod that had meant more than 1,000 words of praise. He remembered winters, when the demand for candles was so great that he and his father had worked long into the night. The workshop warm despite the cold outside, the two of them moving in companionable silence, the work creating a bond that needed no words to strengthen it. The rain began while he worked, so softly at first that he didn't immediately notice. It was only when the sound registered, a gentle pattering against the window, a whisper against the roof, that he looked up and saw the water streaking the glass. A winter rain, cold but not freezing, the kind that would turn the streets to mud and keep sensible people by their fires. The sound of it was pleasant, a quiet accompaniment to the work of his hands. Inside the workshop, all was warmth and light and the sweet smell of beeswax. Outside, the gray afternoon grew grayer, but it seemed distant, separate, a different world entirely. Dip, lift, wait, dip, lift, wait. The candles were taking shape now, growing from thin tapers to something more substantial. Mr. Halbrook's experienced eye judged their progress. A few more rounds, perhaps, and they would be ready. Not too thick. These were meant to be elegant, refined, suitable for the cathedral's altar. Too thick, and they would look clumsy, inappropriate. He continued his work, his breathing slow and even, his movements steady and sure. There was no part of him that was elsewhere, no portion of his attention that wished to be doing something other than what he was doing. This was enough. This had always been enough. The workshop settled into a stillness, broken only by the sound of the rain, the occasional crackle of the fire in the stove, and the gentle dripping of wax back into the pot as each taper was lifted. Time seemed to soften, to stretch, to become less a series of distinct moments and more a continuous stream, flowing quietly onward. Mr. Halbrook's hands moved through the wax and through the air, dipping and lifting, creating beauty through simple repetition. His shadow on the wall behind him moved in rhythm, a dark companion performing the same patient dance. And slowly, gradually, the candles approached completion, each one a small testament to the value of careful work, of attention paid, of craft honored. The rain continued to fall. The afternoon deepened, and in the warm, wax-scented workshop, an old man's hands continued their ancient work, as they had done yesterday, and the day before, and would do tomorrow and the day after that. Dip, lift, wait, dip, lift, wait. The rhythm of making, the rhythm of living, the rhythm of a life well spent in the quiet creation of light. Part 3. The Bell Above the Door. The bell above the shop door was a small brass thing, tarnished with age, but still possessed of a clear, sweet voice. Mr. Halbrook had hunted there himself when he was still a young man, newly inheriting the shop from his father, wanting to put his own small mark upon the place. Over the years, that bell had announced thousands of visitors, and its sound had become so woven into the fabric of his days that he sometimes heard it in his dreams. It rang now, just as he was hanging the finished tapers to complete their drying, its gentle chime cutting through the quiet of the late morning with a sound that was more greeting than interruption. Mr. Halbrook wiped his hands on his apron, though they were quite clean. This too was habit, and made his way from the workshop to the shop. Through the doorway he could see a figure silhouetted against the watery light from the window, a shape he recognized even before features became clear. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. A wet day to be out and about. Ashworth was pushing back the hood of her cloak, revealing a face that bore its 70 years with grace, the lines around her eyes and mouth speaking of a life well lived and much smiled through. She was a small woman, neat in her movements, and she had been coming to Mr. Halbrook's shop every Tuesday morning for longer than either of them cared to precisely remember. "Good morning, Mr. Halbrook," she replied, her voice carrying the particular warmth reserved for old friends. Wet indeed, but one cannot let a little rain dictate one's schedule. The week would fall to pieces entirely if one did. She was the schoolteacher at St. Mary's, had been for 40 years, and she brought to all aspects of her life the same gentle discipline she brought to her classroom. Mr. Halbrook had always admired that about her, the way she moved through the world with purpose but without hurry, accomplishing much through steady application rather than dramatic effort. "I suspect your pupils were not quite so philosophical about the rain this morning," Mr. Halbrook said, moving to help her with her cloak. Mrs. Ashworth laughed softly. The younger ones arrived looking like a collection of drowned mice, all complaining most dramatically. But they settled soon enough once we began the day's lessons. Children are wonderfully resilient creatures, though they do enjoy a bit of theatrical suffering when the opportunity presents itself. She shook out her cloak and hung it on the peg by the door, where it began to drip quietly onto the stone floor. Mr. Halbrook made a mental note to put down a cloth later, though he suspected he would forget, as he always did, and simply wipe up the small puddle before closing for the evening. "I've come for my usual order," Mrs. Ashworth said, turning to survey the shelves with the air of one who has time to spare and intends to enjoy spending it, though I confess I'm in no great hurry. The children have their geography examination this afternoon, and Mr. Palmer is proctoring. I have a blessed hour of freedom before I need to return." "Then you must have tea," Mr. Halbrook said decisively. "The kettle is already hot, and I was just thinking how pleasant a cup would be." It was a small fiction. This, he had not been thinking of tea at all, but it was the sort of fiction that smoothed the social path, that allowed one to offer hospitality without making the other feel they were imposing. Mrs. Ashworth understood this perfectly well, and she smiled in acknowledgement of the gentle dance they were performing. "Tea would be most welcome," she said. "Thank you." Mr. Halbrook retreated to the small back room where he kept his personal things: a tin for tea, a small spirit kettle, 2 cups that had belonged to his mother, their porcelain so fine that light showed through when they were held up to a candle. He prepared the tea with the same careful attention he brought to his candle making, warming the pot, measuring the leaves, waiting for the water to reach the precise moment between boiling and cooling when tea was best made. When he returned to the shop, Mrs. Ashworth had settled herself on the chair he kept near the counter for those customers who wished to sit while they made their selections or discussed their orders. She had removed her gloves and was holding her hands out to the warmth radiating from the candles that burned throughout the shop. "It's always so wonderfully warm in here," she said as he handed her a cup of tea. "Even on the coldest days, one steps through your door and feels immediately comforted." "Candlelight carries warmth in more ways than one," Mr. Halbrook said, settling himself on his stool. "Though I confess the shop does stay warmer than one might expect. The workshop especially, all that melted wax, all those small flames. It's quite pleasant in winter." They sipped their tea in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that can exist only between people who have known each other long enough that conversation is a choice rather than an obligation. Through the window, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the glass. The street outside was largely empty, only the occasional hurried figure passing by, head down against the weather. The world seemed to have drawn in upon itself, seeking shelter and warmth, content to wait out the rain in whatever safe harbor it could find. "I've been thinking about candlelight," Mrs. Ashworth said eventually, her voice reflective. "Teaching the children about the invention of the gas lamp last week, and of course, they find it all terribly exciting, this modern world of ours. But I found myself rather sad, thinking about what we're losing." Mr. Halbrook nodded slowly. He had thought similar thoughts many times, though he tried not to dwell on them overmuch. Progress was coming, as it always did, and one could not stop it any more than one could stop the rain or the turning of the seasons. "Candlelight has a quality to it," Mrs. Ashworth continued, "a gentleness that these bright gas flames lack. When I was a child, we read by candlelight every evening. My father would light the candles one by one, and it was like a signal. The day's work was done. The night's peace had begun. There was something sacred about it, I think. Something that marked the transition from labor to rest." "There is an honesty to candlelight," Mr. Halbrook said quietly. "It doesn't pretend to be stronger than it is. It illuminates what is near and leaves the far corners in shadow. It reminds us that we cannot see everything, know everything, control everything, and there is a comfort in that, I find." Ashworth looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard a truth they already knew but had not known how to articulate. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, exactly that." They sat together in the warm glow of the shop, 2 old friends sharing tea and thoughts, while outside the world rushed past in the rain. Here, time seemed to pool like candle wax, accumulating slowly, creating something solid and real from what had been liquid and formless. The children love candles. Still, Mrs. Ashworth said after a moment. "At Christmas, when we light the ones on our classroom tree, they become quite reverent. Even the rowdiest boys fall silent. There's something about a candle flame that speaks to something deep in us, I think. Something ancient and essential." "Fire was our first technology," Mr. Halbrook observed. "Before tools, before language perhaps. The first thing we learned to carry with us, to create on demand. Light and warmth and safety, all in one small flame. We've been watching fires burn for as long as we've been human. It's no wonder it still speaks to us." "You're quite the philosopher, Mr. Halbrook," Mrs. Ashworth said with a gentle smile. "Not at all," he replied, a little embarrassed. "Merely an old man who has spent too much time alone with his thoughts and his candles. I think perhaps candles make philosophers of us all," Mrs. Ashworth said. "They burn quietly and steadily, and they invite us to do the same." The conversation drifted then to other matters: how the winter term was progressing, which students showed promise, how Mrs. Ashworth's sister in Durham was recovering from her illness. They spoke of the preparations being made for Christmas, of the decorations that would go up in the streets, of the services that would be held at the cathedral. Mr. Halbrook found himself mentioning, almost without meaning to, the candle on the high shelf, the one that burned longer than it ought. He had not spoken of it to anyone before, and he was surprised to hear the words coming from his own mouth. Mrs. Ashworth listened with interest, her head tilted slightly to one side, her expression thoughtful but not skeptical. "Perhaps," she said when he had finished, "it's the shop's way of holding on to something. Memory, maybe, or hope, or just the simple pleasure of burning a bit longer than expected." Mr. Halbrook considered this. "That's a nicer explanation than most I've considered." "Everything deserves a nice explanation if we can manage it," Mrs. Ashworth said firmly. "The world is mysterious enough without us making it darker than it needs to be." They finished their tea as the church bells tolled noon, the sound rolling across the rooftops and in through the shop window, marking the passage of time in that old familiar way that had been marking it since long before either of them had been born. Mrs. Ashworth rose, straightening her skirts and reaching for her gloves. "I suppose I must return to my duties. Mr. Palmer will be wondering where I've gotten to." "Your usual order?" Mr. Halbrook asked, standing as well. "Yes, please." The bell chimed as she left, its voice bright and clear. Through the window, Mr. Halbrook watched her make her way down the street, the parcel tucked under her arm, her step light despite the puddles. The shop seemed quieter after she had gone, but it was not an empty quiet. It was the quiet of a space that had just held friendship, that still bore the warmth of shared company. Mr. Halbrook collected the teacups and returned them to their shelf, then stood for a moment in the center of his shop, surrounded by candles, surrounded by light. Outside, the rain was indeed easing, and somewhere above the clouds, the winter sun was trying to break through. Part 4. The Girl with the Ribbon. The afternoon had settled into that particular quality of light that comes on winter days after rain, when the world seems washed clean and the air holds a clarity that makes distant things seem near. The clouds had broken apart, revealing patches of pale blue sky, and occasional shafts of sunlight found their way down into the narrow street, illuminating the wet cobblestones and making them gleam like polished stone. Mr. Halbrook was at his workbench, rolling beeswax sheets around wicks to create pillar candles, a quicker method than dipping, though one that required its own particular skill. The wax sheets were warm and pliable, and they had to be rolled with just the right tension, tight enough to hold together, but not so tight that the candle became dense and difficult to burn. He was concentrating on this delicate work when the bell above the door rang again, a sound different somehow from its usual tone, lighter, more tentative, as though uncertain of its welcome. Mr. Halbrook looked up to see a child standing just inside the doorway. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, small for her age, with a face that was more thoughtful than most children's faces tend to be. Her dress was clean but much mended. The fabric faded from many washings. Over it she wore a shawl that had probably belonged to her mother or an older sister, far too large for her small frame. Her hair was brown and had been braided with care, tied with a blue ribbon that looked newer than anything else she wore. What struck Mr. Halbrook most was the way she stood, very still, very quiet, taking in the shop with wide eyes that moved from shelf to shelf, candle to candle, as though she had stepped into a place of wonder. "Good afternoon," Mr. Halbrook said gently, setting down his work and wiping his hands. He was careful to keep his voice soft, for he could see that the child was somewhat intimidated by the shop, or perhaps by him, or perhaps simply by the strangeness of being somewhere unfamiliar. The girl bobbed something that might have been a curtsy, an old-fashioned gesture that spoke of a household where manners were taught and expected. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How may I help you?" Mr. Halbrook asked, coming around the counter but keeping a respectful distance. Some children were comfortable with strangers, eager and talkative. Others needed space and time to find their courage. This child, he could see, was one of the latter. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a handkerchief, which she unfolded with great care. Nested in the fabric were several coins, pennies mostly, and a few halfpennies, their copper faces dull but clean, as though they had been polished for this very occasion. "I should like to buy a candle, please," the girl said, her eyes fixed on the coins in her handkerchief rather than on Mr. Halbrook's face. "For my mother. It's her birthday tomorrow." "I see," Mr. Halbrook said, and his heart, which he sometimes thought had grown rather stolid with age, softened considerably. "Well then, this is important business indeed. A birthday candle must be chosen with care." The girl looked up at him then, and he saw relief in her eyes. Relief that he had understood, that he was taking her seriously, that he was not going to dismiss her as merely a child with pocket change. "How much have you got there?" he asked, nodding toward the handkerchief. The girl bit her lower lip, concentrating. "6pence, sir. I've been saving. I do small jobs for Mrs. Patterson next door, running errands and such, and my brother gave me a penny for helping him with his lessons. 6pence. Not a fortune, but earned through effort, through small labors and patience." Mr. Halbrook felt the weight of responsibility that came with such money. It represented not just copper, but time, energy, the sacrifice of other things the child might have spent it on. "6pence will buy a very fine candle indeed," he said. "But the question is, what sort of candle would your mother like best? Tall or short? Thick or thin? Plain or decorated?" The girl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Her brow furrowed slightly as she thought. "Mother likes simple things," she said after a moment. "She says fussy things just gather dust and make more work. But she likes nice things too. Things that are. She struggled for the word, and Mr. Halbrook waited patiently. "Pretty," she finished finally, though he could tell that wasn't quite the word she had been reaching for. "Things that make the house feel warmer. Kinder." Halbrook nodded slowly. He understood exactly what the child meant, even if the language wasn't quite there yet. Some things possessed a quality beyond mere prettiness, a rightness, a gentleness, a way of making the spaces they occupied feel more like home. "I think I know just the thing," he said. "Come, with me." He led her along the shelves, moving slowly, giving her time to look at the candles they passed. Her eyes widened at the tall tapers, lingered on the decorated pillars with their intricate patterns pressed into the wax, moved past the utilitarian tallow candles without much interest. Mr. Halbrook stopped at a shelf midway down the shop where several dozen pillared candles stood in neat rows. They were made of beeswax, pale gold in color, undecorated but beautifully formed with a simple elegance that needed no embellishment. "These are made from the wax of bees," he told her, taking one down and holding it so she could see it better. "They smell of honey when they burn, and they give a particularly warm light. This one would burn for many evenings, several hours each time, perhaps 20 or 30 hours in all." The girl reached out tentatively, and Mr. Halbrook placed the candle in her hands. She held it carefully, as though it were something precious, turning it slowly, examining it from all angles. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Then, with visible reluctance, she asked, "How much does it cost?" Halbrook appeared to consider this, though he had already decided on his answer the moment he saw the coins in her handkerchief. "Well now, let me think. A candle of this quality? This size? Typically these sell for 9 pence. He saw her face fall, saw her fingers tighten slightly on the candle she held, already preparing to hand it back. However, he continued, "It happens that I made rather too many of these last week. I've got more than I need, and they'll only sit on the shelf getting dusty. For stock I'm looking to move along, I generally offer a reduction. Shall we say 6 pence? Hope and joy and relief all mixed together in an expression so transparent, so genuinely felt, that Mr. Halbrook had to turn away for a moment, making a show of adjusting something on a nearby shelf. "Really?" the girl asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Truly 6 pence? Truly," Mr. Halbrook confirmed. "It seems a fair price to me. What do you think?" "Oh, yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Mother will love it. She'll love it so much she sits by the window in the evenings and does her sewing. And the light isn't very good there. And this will help her see. And it will smell lovely and—" She stopped, suddenly shy again, as though she had said too much. "I'm very glad," Mr. Halbrook said simply. "Now then, we must wrap it properly. A gift deserves to be presented well." He took the candle back to the counter, and the girl followed, clutching her handkerchief of coins. From beneath the counter, Mr. Halbrook drew out his wrapping supplies: brown paper, tissue paper for cushioning, and a spool of ribbon. He worked slowly, deliberately, allowing the girl to watch as he layered the tissue paper around the candle, creating a soft nest that would protect it. Then he wrapped the whole thing in the brown paper, creasing the edges with precision, tucking the ends just so. "Now," he said, "every gift needs a ribbon." He had ribbons in several colors, kept for just this purpose. He could have chosen any of them, but his eyes fell on a spool of blue silk ribbon, almost the exact shade of the ribbon in the girl's hair. He cut a length and tied it around the package, forming a neat bow at the top. The girl watched his fingers work, her expression rapt. "There," he said, holding up the finished package. "Fit for a birthday, I should think." The girl carefully counted out her 6 pence, placing each coin on the counter with solemn ceremony. Mr. Halbrook accepted them with equal gravity, acknowledging the importance of the transaction for both of them. When he held out the wrapped candle, the girl took it and held it close to her chest as though it were made of glass and might shatter if not carefully guarded. "Thank you," she said, and there was such feeling in the words that they seemed to carry more weight than 2 syllables should rightly be able to hold. "Thank you ever so much, Mr. Halbrook," he supplied. "Edwin Halbrook." "And you're very welcome, miss," Emily, sir. Emily Wright. Well, Miss Emily Wright, I hope your mother has a very happy birthday. I'll tell her you said so, sir. And I'll tell her about the shop and the candles and how kind you were. And when I've saved more money, I'll come back and buy another. Because Mother will love this one so much she'll be sad when it's all burned down. Candles are meant to be burned, Mr. Halbrook said gently. Their purpose is to give light and warmth, and they can't do that unless they're lit. But you're always welcome here, Miss Emily. Anytime you need a candle, you come and see old Mr. Halbrook, and we'll find just the right one. Emily nodded seriously, committing this to memory. Then she bobbed another of her old-fashioned curtsies and made for the door. She paused on the threshold, turning back to look at the shop one more time. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window now, catching the hundreds of candles and making them glow as though they were all lit at once. The shop seemed to shimmer with potential light, with warmth waiting to be released. It's like being inside a treasure box, Emily said wonderingly. Mr. Halbrook smiled. I've never thought of it quite that way, but yes, I suppose it is. The bell chimed as she left, and through the window, he watched her skip down the street, the wrapped candle held carefully in both hands, her too large shawl fluttering behind her like wings. Mr. Halbrook returned to his workbench, but he found he needed a moment before resuming his work. He stood quietly in the center of his shop, thinking about small girls with braided hair and blue ribbons, about mothers who sat by windows doing their sewing, about sixpences earned through small labors and spent with great care. The world, he thought, contained more goodness than one sometimes remembered. It was hidden in ordinary moments, in simple transactions, in the earnest efforts of children trying to make their mothers happy. He picked up the beeswax sheet he had been working with before Emily arrived. It had cooled somewhat in the interim, and he needed to warm it again before continuing. But that was all right. Some things were worth pausing for. Some things, like kindness, like generosity, like the look of wonder in a child's eyes, were worth any interruption. The afternoon light continued to stream through the window, and Mr. Halbrook returned to his work, his hands moving with their customary skill, his heart a little lighter than it had been an hour before. Part 5. The Candle on the High Shelf. The day was drawing toward its close when Mr. Halbrook found himself once again standing in the center of his shop. His work complete, the final tasks of cleaning and organizing accomplished. The light outside had taken on that particular amber quality that comes just before sunset in winter, when the low sun turns everything it touches to gold. His eyes, as they so often did in these quiet moments, traveled to the high shelf behind the counter, to the candle that stood there, slightly apart from its neighbors, neither the largest nor the smallest, neither elaborately decorated nor entirely plain, just a simple pillar of pale beeswax that seemed to gather the light of the shop and hold it the way a pond holds the sky. Mr. Halbrook had not lit it today. He had not lit it yesterday either, nor for several days before that. Yet he found himself thinking about it with the sort of gentle, persistent curiosity one might feel about a familiar mystery, the kind that does not demand solving, but invites contemplation. He moved closer to the counter, tilting his head back to see it better. Even in the dimming light, even surrounded by dozens of other candles, it seemed to possess a quality that set it apart. Not glow exactly, for it was not lit, but a kind of presence, a quiet insistence on being noticed. How long had it been there? Mr. Halbrook tried to remember and found that he could not pin down a specific date. Years, certainly. Perhaps a decade. perhaps longer. Time had a way of becoming fluid when one spent it in the company of unchanging things, the shop, the tools, the daily rhythms of work. One day flowed into the next, and before one quite realized it, years had passed. He was certain he had made the candle himself. It bore the marks of his hand, the slight variations in surface texture that came from his particular way of working the wax, the precise proportions that he had settled on decades ago and never varied from. This was his work, without question. But when and for whom? Most of the candles he made were sold within days or weeks of their making. Only a few remained in stock for long periods, kept as examples or as emergency reserves. Yet, this one had remained, year after year, a quiet presence on the high shelf. Mr. Halbrook considered fetching the step stool from the workshop so he could examine it more closely. But even as the thought formed, he decided against it. There was something about leaving it where it was, about maintaining the small distance between himself and the candle, that felt right. Some mysteries were meant to be observed from a distance, not dissected. Instead, he simply looked at it, allowing his mind to drift. The candle was approximately 8 inches tall, he estimated. Perhaps 3 inches in diameter. A substantial piece, but not ostentatious. The sort of candle one might light for a special occasion, or keep burning through a long winter evening, or place in a window to guide someone home. The color was distinctive. Now that he focused on it, most beeswax ranged from pale yellow to deep gold, depending on what flowers the bees had visited, how the wax had been processed, how long it had been stored. But this candle had a quality to its color that was difficult to name. Almost white, but not quite. Almost cream, but somehow clearer than that. It reminded him of morning light or of candlelight reflected in snow. The wick he could see from where he stood was pristine. Unburned? Or was it? He squinted, trying to be certain. No, there was definitely some evidence of burning. The wick was slightly darkened at the tip, and there was a subtle depression around it in the wax, the kind that formed when a candle was lit, and the wax around the wick melted into a pool. So it had been lit. He remembered that much at least. He had taken it down from the shelf on various occasions and used it in the shop, adding its light to all the others. But always, and this was the strange thing, always when he returned it to the shelf, it seemed no smaller than it had been. Candles burned. That was their nature, their purpose. They gave light and warmth at the cost of their own substance, consuming themselves slowly in the service of others. This was the fundamental truth of candle making, the basic transaction that made the craft possible and necessary. But this candle seemed to have its own arrangement with that truth. It burned, yes. He had seen the flame, seen the wax pool and the wick glow, but somehow, impossibly, it remained unchanged. Or if it changed, it did so at a pace so glacial as to be imperceptible. Mr. Halbrook smiled to himself. He was an old man, given perhaps to fancy in a way he had not been when younger. Likely the candle had diminished, and he simply had not noticed. The changes would be tiny, a fraction of an inch over months, perhaps too small for the eye to catch when one saw the candle every day. And yet, there was something about it, something that went beyond rational explanation into the realm of feeling, of instinct. The candle wanted to be there, on that high shelf. It belonged there, and it would remain there, burning slowly or not burning at all, for as long as the shop stood and Mr. Halbrook tended it. He thought about the people who had come into the shop over the years, All the customers and visitors who had stood where he was standing now, conducting their business, making their purchases. How many of them had noticed the candle? How many had looked up and seen it there, a pale presence keeping watch over the transactions below? Probably none, he thought, or very few. People came to a chandler's shop with specific needs, specific purposes. They wanted candles for their homes, their churches, their businesses. They wanted light, warmth, utility. They did not come to contemplate mysteries. And that was fine. That was as it should be. The candle did not need to be noticed by everyone. It did not need to be understood. It simply needed to be. Mr. Halbrook found a peculiar comfort in that thought. The world was full of things that existed without requiring acknowledgement, without demanding explanation. Trees grew in forests where no one walked. Stars shone in skies no one watched. And candles stood on high shelves in quiet shops, patient and persistent, waiting for nothing in particular. He moved away from the counter and went to the window, looking out at the street. The day's last light was painting the opposite buildings in shades of rose and amber. A few people hurried past, eager to get home before full darkness fell. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying with it the smell of coal fires and cooking dinners. Soon he would need to light the evening candles, the ones that would burn while he completed his final tasks, had his supper, and prepared for the night. But not quite yet. There was still enough natural light to see by, still enough warmth in the air, that the shop did not yet feel like it needed the particular comfort that candlelight provided. He thought about Emily Wright, the small girl who had come in that afternoon to buy a candle for her mother's birthday. She would be home by now, he imagined. Perhaps she had already given her mother the gift, or perhaps she was waiting until tomorrow, until the actual birthday. Either way, she would be treasuring that wrapped package, anticipating the moment when it would be unwrapped, when her mother would see what she had chosen, what she had saved for. Mr. Halbrook hoped the candle would serve them well. He hoped it would give good light on dark evenings, would smell pleasantly of beeswax and honey, would last long enough to feel like a proper gift, but not so long that its eventual burning down would not create space for Emily to buy another, to have another reason to save her pennies and make another journey to the shop. Candles were meant to be burned. He had told Emily that, and it was true. A candle that was never lit, that was kept pristine and perfect and untouched, was a candle that had failed in its purpose, no matter how beautiful it might be. And yet, his eyes drifted back to the high shelf, to the pale candle standing in its appointed place. And yet, there were exceptions to every rule. There were candles that existed for reasons beyond the purely practical, candles that served purposes more subtle than mere illumination. That candle, he thought, was like a bookmark in the story of the shop. It marked a place, held a space, created a sense of continuity that transcended the daily flux of business and seasons. Customers came and went, stock was sold and replenished. Years passed and Mr. Halbrook grew older, and the world outside changed in ways both small and large. But the candle remained, constant, patient, present. There was something deeply satisfying about that. Something that spoke to a part of Mr. Halbrook that valued constancy, that found comfort in the unchanging elements of his life. The shop itself was one such element. It had looked essentially the same for decades, and he saw no reason to alter it. His daily routines were another, the same tasks, performed in the same order, day after day, year after year. And the candle on the high shelf was a third. A small thing perhaps, an insignificant thing to anyone who did not spend their days in this shop, who did not know the quiet pleasure of looking up and seeing it there, reliable as sunrise. Mr. Halbrook realized he was smiling, Here he was, an old man standing alone in a shop full of candles, contemplating one particular candle with what amounted to affection. If anyone could see into his thoughts at this moment, they would think him quite peculiar. But no, one could see into his thoughts. His thoughts were his own, private and unobserved. And if he chose to spend a few minutes of a winter evening thinking about a candle that burned longer than it should, that remained when other candles had long since guttered out, well, there were stranger things in the world to occupy one's mind. The light outside was fading more quickly now. The amber had deepened to something closer to copper, and soon it would fade to gray and then to black. Mr. Halbrook stirred himself from his contemplation and went to fetch the taper he used for lighting the evening candles. He worked his way around the shop, touching flame to wick, watching as each candle caught and brightened. The shop filled with warm light, with moving shadows, with that particular atmosphere that belonged to evening in a chandler's shop. Intimate, enclosed, separate from the darkening world outside. When he had finished, he stood once more in the center of the room, surrounded by light, surrounded by the work of his hands and the legacy of his craft. Above him, on the high shelf, the pale candle stood unlit, catching and reflecting the glow of all the others, patient in its mystery, content in its place. Mr. Halbrook nodded to it, a small gesture of acknowledgement, almost a greeting. Then he turned to his evening tasks, leaving the candle to its quiet vigil, as he had done yesterday and would do tomorrow and all the days after that. Part 6. Light from Another Winter. The evening had settled fully by the time Mr. Halbrook sat down with his supper, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold mutton, accompanied by a pot of tea that had steeped perhaps a bit too long, but was none the worse for it. He ate at the small table in the room behind the shop, the same room where he slept, where he kept his few personal possessions, where he had lived out the private hours of his life for longer than he cared to calculate. The room was small but sufficient. A narrow bed stood against one wall, made up with such precision that the blankets might have been drawn with a ruler. A wardrobe held his modest collection of clothing. A single chair, the one he sat in now, was drawn up to the table, and on the walls, a few items that connected him to the past. A tintype photograph of his parents, both long since passed, standing stiffly in their Sunday best. A small watercolor of the Yorkshire moors, painted by his mother when she was young. And a wooden cross, simple and unadorned, that had hung above his father's workbench. As he ate, Mr. Halbrook's thoughts drifted backward, pulled by the gravity of memory, toward other winters, other evenings, other moments when he had sat in this same chair, in this same room, while candlelight pushed back the darkness. He thought of the winter when he was 12, when his father first allowed him to make a candle entirely by himself, selecting the wax, cutting the wick, performing all the steps without supervision or help. It had been a simple taper, nothing special, but when it was finished and his father had examined it with those keen eyes that miss no flaw, he had said, "Well done, Edwin. That's a candle that will give good light." Such small praise, but it had felt like a coronation. He thought of the winter when he was 19, when Sarah Ashford had come into the shop one December afternoon to buy candles for her family's Christmas celebrations. She had been 17, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold lights of their own, and Mr. Halbrook had stammered through the transaction like a fool, dropping coins and wrapping the candles with hands that suddenly forgot their skill. She had smiled at his awkwardness with a kindness that made him love her more, and when she left, the shop had seemed dimmer for her absence. They had walked out together for 2 years after that, he and Sarah. Long walks through York's ancient streets, conversations that ranged from the profound to the delightfully trivial, plans for a future that seemed certain and bright, He had imagined her in this shop, had imagined children, his and hers, learning the craft as he had learned it, carrying it forward into time. But Sarah had taken ill the winter she was 19, a fever that had swept through the city, claiming young and old with what seemed like random cruelty. She had died on a Tuesday morning in January, and Mr. Halbrook had stood by her grave in the frozen ground and felt something in himself die as well. Not all of him, enough remained to continue living, to continue working, to carry on. But the part that had imagined a different future, a shared life, a house full of warmth and voices, that part had gone into the ground with Sarah. He had never walked out with anyone else. There had been opportunities. Over the years, well-meaning friends had suggested this widow or that unmarried cousin, but Mr. Halbrook had found that he was content with his solitude, or if not content, then at least reconciled to it. The shop needed him, the work needed doing, and in the making of candles, in the daily rhythms of his craft, he found a purpose that was sufficient. He thought of the winter when his father had died, 30 years ago now, though it sometimes seemed like yesterday. His father had worked until the very end, his hands still steady even when his breath had become labored, his step slow. He had died peacefully in his sleep one February night, and Mr. Halbrook had found him the next morning, looking more restful than he had in years. The shop had felt unbearably empty after that. For months, Mr. Halbrook had found himself turning to ask his father a question, to share an observation, only to remember that there was no one there to answer, no one to listen. The silence had been profound, disorienting, but gradually he had grown accustomed to it. He had learned to hold conversations in his mind, to imagine what his father would say in response to this difficulty or that small triumph. And in time, those imagined conversations had become a kind of comfort, a way of maintaining connection across the barrier of death. He thought of happier winters too. The winter when Mrs. Ashworth had first come to the shop, beginning a friendship that had now lasted decades. The winter when he had received a commission to provide all the candles for a wealthy merchant's daughter's wedding, 200 candles of various sizes and types, all to be delivered within a fortnight. He had worked day and night to fulfill that order, and when it was complete and installed in the church, the effect had been breathtaking. The bride had wept at the sight of so much light, and the merchant had paid him double what they had agreed upon. He thought of the winter when snow had fallen so heavily that the streets of York had become impassable for days. He had been snowed in, the shop cut off from the world, and he had spent the time in peaceful industry, making candles no one could come to buy, organizing stock that was already organized, simply enjoying the enforced solitude and the particular quality of silence that comes with heavy snow. All these memories and more seemed to hang in the air of the small room like smoke from spent candles, visible if one knew how to look, invisible to casual observation. They were part of the texture of his life, the accumulated weight of years, lived in one place, doing one thing, watching seasons turn and return. Mr. Halbrook finished his supper and sat for a moment with his empty plate before him, his teacup cradled in both hands. The tea had gone lukewarm, but he drank it anyway, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of it. He wondered sometimes about the candle on the high shelf. When had he made it? He could not remember, and the not remembering troubled him slightly. His memory was generally good. He could recall orders from years past, remember the preferences of customers who had long since moved away or died. But the origin of that particular candle remained stubbornly hidden, as though that memory had been carefully removed, leaving no gap to mark its absence. Perhaps, he thought, it had been made in those early days after Sarah's death, when he had worked long into the nights, unable to sleep, finding solace only in the familiar motions of his craft. He had made hundreds of candles during that time, maybe thousands, working with a kind of desperate focus that kept grief at bay. Or perhaps it had been later, after his father died, during another period of loss and adjustment. Grief had a way of blurring time, of making days and weeks run together into an indistinct flow. But there was another possibility, one that he entertained without quite believing it, the way one might entertain a pleasant fiction. Perhaps the candle had not been made by him at all. Perhaps it had been made by his father, or even his grandfather, and had simply been there on that high shelf since before Mr. Halbrook's memory began. Perhaps it was an heirloom of sorts, a piece of family history that had survived through luck or magic or simple persistence. He knew this was unlikely. He knew every candle in his shop, knew which were his own work and which were not. And yet the idea persisted, gentle and persistent as the candle itself. What would his father say about it if he could ask him? Mr. Halbrook tried to imagine the conversation. His father had been a practical man, not given to fancy. He would likely have looked at the candle, examined it carefully, and then pronounced it a well-made piece that was burning slowly due to excellent craftsmanship and high-quality materials. But would there have been something else in his eyes? Some small acknowledgement of mystery, of the strange and inexplicable things that sometimes happened in a chandler's shop? Mr. Halbrook liked to think so. He rose from the table and carried his dishes to the small basin where he washed them. The water was cold, but he was used to that. He cleaned each item methodically, dried it, and returned it to its proper place. Order was important. Order created peace. When the small tasks of the evening were complete, Mr. Halbrook returned to the shop. Several of the candles he had lit earlier had burned down and needed replacing. He attended to this, then stood in the center of the room, as had become his evening habit, simply looking at the space he had tended for so long. The shop was beautiful in candlelight. It always had been. The warm glow softened edges, created depths and shadows that transformed the familiar into something almost magical. This was the shop at its best. Mr. Halbrook thought, not in the bright light of day, when every flaw and worn surface was visible, but in the gentle light of evening, when everything was touched with gold. His eyes rose to the high shelf, to the pale candle that stood there. If that candle could speak, what stories would it tell? What winters had it witnessed? What sorrows and joys had played out beneath its silent gaze? Mr. Halbrook smiled at his own fancy. Candles did not speak, of course. They simply burned, or waited to burn, patient and uncomplaining. And yet, in their burning, they did tell a kind of story. The story of transformation, of substance becoming light and heat. The story of service, of purpose fulfilled through self-consumption. The story of temporary beauty, of illumination that lasted only as long as there was wax to feed it. Every candle was a small story. Some were short stories, burning out in an hour or two. Others were longer, sustaining their light through many evenings. But all of them eventually came to their end. That was the nature of candles. That was the bargain they made with the darkness. All except one, perhaps. One that had found a way to burn without burning out, to give light without surrendering substance. One that stood on a high shelf year after year, keeping watch, holding its mystery close. Mr. Halbrook reached up, almost without thinking, his hand extending toward the shelf, but he stopped before touching it. Leave it be, he thought. Leave it in its place. Some things are better observed than analyzed, better wondered about than understood. He lowered his hand and turned away. Outside, the night was deep and cold. Inside, the shop glowed with warm light, and on the high shelf, the pale candle stood in its accustomed place, neither near nor far, neither present nor absent, but something in between, a point of continuity in a changing world, a small anchor against the tide of time. Mr. Halbrook moved toward his room, toward his narrow bed and his night's rest. But before he left the shop, he paused at the threshold and looked back one more time. The candle, unlit, seemed nonetheless to glow with a light of its own, or perhaps it was only reflecting the lights around it, gathering them up and giving them back as it always had, as it always would. "Good night," Mr. Halbrook said softly, to the candle, to the shop, to the accumulated memories of all the winters that had come before. Then he passed through the door, leaving the candles to their vigil, leaving the night to deepen as it would. Part 7. Evening in the workshop. The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning where frost painted intricate patterns on every window and breath-formed clouds in the air. Mr. Halbrook woke early, as always, and went through his morning rituals with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized his movements for decades. The day passed in its customary rhythm. Customers came and went, fewer than on market days, but steady nonetheless. A clerk from one of the larger houses came to order candles for their employer's Christmas celebrations. 2 young men, students by the look of them, purchased tapers for their late-night studying. An elderly woman bought a simple votive candle to light at the cathedral in memory of her departed husband. Each transaction was conducted with courtesy and care. Each customer left with exactly what they needed, wrapped and ready. And between customers, Mr. Halbrook worked in his workshop, preparing stock, maintaining his tools, keeping his hands busy with the work that gave shape to his days. But it was the evening that truly began this part of our story. That time when the day's labor was complete and the shop began its slow transition from place of business to place of rest. The sun was setting behind the western rooftops of York as Mr. Halbrook completed his final sale of the day. He had just finished wrapping a pair of pillar candles for Mr. Weatherby, the bookseller from 2 streets over, and was accepting payment when he noticed the quality of light coming through the window. It was that particular shade of amber that seems to exist for only a handful of minutes each day, when the sun is low enough to paint everything in warm tones, but not yet so low as to surrender the sky to twilight. The light came through the window at a sharp angle, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the air and turning them into tiny stars. Mr. Weatherby noticed it too. "Beautiful evening," he remarked, pausing at the door with his wrapped package under his arm. "Makes one grateful for windows facing west." Halbrook agreed. Every sunset is a gift, but winter sunsets seem especially fine. Perhaps because they're so brief. Mr. Weatherby nodded and took his leave, the bell chiming his departure. Mr. Halbrook watched him walk past the window, his figure briefly silhouetted against the golden light. And then he was gone, disappeared around the corner. The shop fell quiet. Mr. Halbrook stood for a moment, simply listening to the silence. It was not absolute, this silence. He could hear the settling of the building around him, the distant sound of cartwheels on cobblestones, the faint ringing of church bells marking the hour. But these sounds only deepened the quiet rather than breaking it, the way a single drop of ink makes water more transparent by giving it something to be compared against. He moved to the window and looked out at the street. The sunset was intensifying. the amber deepening to copper and gold. The buildings across the way were transformed by it, their ordinary brick and timber facades becoming something precious, something worth pausing to admire. A few people passed by, hurrying home before full darkness fell. A man with a walking stick, a woman with a basket, 2 children running ahead of their mother, their voices carrying in the cold air. All of them were touched by the sunset light, all of them briefly beautiful in that particular way. That early evening makes everyone beautiful. Mr. Halbrook turned away from the window and began the process of closing the shop for customers, though not yet for the day. He went to the door and turned the sign that hung there from open to closed. He drew the bolt, not locking it entirely. He might still need to step out, but securing it enough that no one would casually enter expecting to make a purchase. Then he moved through the shop, beginning the evening tasks. Some of the candles that had been burning during the day needed trimming or replacing. He attended to this with his customary care, ensuring that each flame was healthy, each wick at the proper length. As he worked, the light outside continued to change. The copper and gold were fading now, giving way to softer shades of rose and lavender. The sky above the rooftops was turning that particular shade of blue that exists only at dusk. Not quite day, not quite night, but something suspended between the two. When the candles were all properly tended, Mr. Halbrook made his way to the workshop. This was his favorite time to work here, in the evening, when the pressure of potential customers was gone, and he could focus entirely on his craft without interruption. He had left a pot of beeswax melting slowly on the stove earlier in the day, and now he checked its progress. The wax was perfectly liquid, golden and fragrant. He would use it to make some of the smaller votives that were popular this time of year. People liked to cluster them together, creating pools of light on tables and windowsills. But before beginning that work, he needed tea. This had become a ritual over the years, this evening tea in the workshop. It marked the transition from the day's business to the evening's craftsmanship, from work done for others to work done for its own sake. The tea itself was nothing special, the same blend he drank in the morning, prepared in the same way, but the context transformed it, made it taste different somehow. Evening tea in the workshop, with the sunset fading outside and the candles beginning to glow more brightly as the natural light failed. This was one of the small pleasures of his life. He prepared the tea on the small spirit stove he kept in the corner of the workshop, separate from the larger stove used for melting wax. The kettle was already filled with water from the morning, and it heated quickly, beginning its quiet song as the water approached boiling. While he waited, Mr. Halbrook tidied his workspace. He arranged his tools with precision: the dipping rods, the molds, the cutting tools, the measuring implements. Each had its place, and each was returned to that place at the end of every work session. This order was not merely aesthetic, it was practical. A chandler's shop, with its open flames and hot wax, was no place for carelessness. Tools left lying about could be knocked over, could cause accidents. Better by far to maintain rigorous organization. The kettle began to whistle softly. Mr. Halbrook removed it from the heat and prepared his tea, watching as the hot water turned the color of the leaves as steam rose and dispersed. He poured the tea into his cup, a simple earthenware thing, chipped at the rim but still perfectly serviceable, and carried it to his workbench. He set it down carefully, away from his work area but close enough to reach easily, and stood for a moment watching the steam rise in thin, wandering tendrils. The workshop was warm from the stove, and the contrast between the warm air and the cold tea created visible currents, patterns of movement that were there and then gone, impossible to capture or hold. Through the high window, the last of the sunset was visible, just a band of pale gold now, fading even as he watched. Soon, it would be gone entirely, and the night would be complete. Mr. Halbrook sipped his tea. It was too hot still, and he had to be careful not to burn his mouth, but the warmth of it spreading through him was welcome. He felt the tension of the day, such as it was. His days were not particularly tense, beginning to ease from his shoulders and back. This was peace, he thought. This moment, this particular configuration of elements, warm workshop, cooling tea, fading light, the scent of beeswax, and the promise of work to come. This was what he had built his life around. This was what he returned to every evening. Not excitement or novelty or surprise, but this steady, reliable comfort. He thought about the people who had come into his shop that day, the clerk ordering candles for his employer's celebration, the students buying tapers for their studies, the elderly woman purchasing her memorial votive. Each of them had their own lives, their own stories, their own reasons for needing light, and he was privileged to provide that light, to be a small but necessary part of their days. There was satisfaction in that, deep satisfaction, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly, but rather settled in quietly, like snow accumulating on a winter night. The street outside had grown quieter now. The rush of people heading home had passed. Occasionally, someone would still walk by, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. But these were individual travelers now, not the stream that had flowed past in the earlier evening. Mr. Halbrook finished his tea and set the cup aside. Time to begin the evening's work. He had votives to make, and the wax was at the perfect temperature. He worked slowly, methodically, pouring the liquid wax into small molds, setting wicks with steady hands. The process was almost automatic after so many years, requiring only a portion of his conscious attention. The rest of his mind was free to drift, to think, to simply be. The workshop settled around him like a familiar coat. The candles burning on the shelves cast their warm glow. The stove radiated its steady heat. The tools lay in their appointed places, ready for use. Everything was as it should be, as it had been, as it would be tomorrow and the day after. Outside, night was falling fully now. The sky had darkened from lavender to deep blue to something approaching black. One by one, lamps were being lit in windows across the city, little points of light appearing in the darkness, each one representing a household, a family, people settling in for the evening. Mr. Halbrook poured another mold, watching as the golden wax filled the small cavity, as the wick centered itself in the liquid. When this wax cooled and hardened, it would be a candle, a small one, true, but complete, capable of giving light, of providing warmth, of serving its purpose. He poured another and another, working in steady rhythm. The workshop was filled with the quiet sounds of his craft, the soft glug of wax pouring, the gentle clink of molds being set aside, the occasional crackle from the stove. Above him, visible if he chose to look up, the high shelf could just be seen through the workshop doorway. And on that shelf, though he could not see it from this angle, the pale candle stood in its place, keeping its vigil, holding its mystery. But Mr. Halbrook did not look up. He was focused on his work, on the task at hand, on the creation of small lights that would burn for a few hours and then be gone, replaced by others, in the endless cycle that was his life and his craft. The evening deepened, the votives multiplied, and in the warm, wax-scented workshop, an old man's hands continued their familiar work, creating light against the darkness, one small candle at a time. Part 8. A Visitor from Long Ago. The following evening brought with it a change in the weather. The clear, cold days had given way to something softer, a low ceiling of clouds that held the warmth close to the earth and promised snow before the week was out. The air had that particular thickness to it, that sense of expectancy that comes before the first real snowfall of winter. Mr. Halbrook had spent the day in quiet productivity. His hands had shaped candles, his mind had wandered its familiar paths, and the hours had passed with the gentle steadiness that characterized all his days. Now, as evening approached, he was in the workshop, cleaning his tools in preparation for tomorrow's work. The bell above the shop door rang, clear and bright in the gathering dusk. Mr. Halbrook set down the tool he had been wiping and made his way to the front of the shop. Through the doorway, he could see a figure standing just inside the entrance, and something about the way the person stood, straight-backed despite evident age, with a stillness that suggested patience and dignity, made him pause for just a moment before stepping forward. As he entered the shop proper, the visitor turned toward him, and Mr. Halbrook found himself looking at a man who might have been anywhere from 70 to 80 years of age. He was tall, or had been before time had begun its slow work of drawing him earthward. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were clear and bright, and they held an expression that Mr. Halbrook could not quite name. Recognition, nostalgia, something gentler than sadness, but touched by the same awareness of time's passage. "Good evening," Mr. Halbrook said, his voice warm but curious. There was something familiar about this man, though he could not immediately place him. "Good evening, Mr. Halbrook," the visitor replied, and his voice, too, carried that quality of age tempered by vitality. "I wonder if you might have a few minutes to speak with an old customer. I promise not to keep you long from your work." "Of course," Mr. Halbrook said. "Please, sit." He gestured to the chair near the counter, the same chair where Mrs. Ashworth had sat for tea several days before. The visitor settled himself carefully, the way elderly people do when their joints have begun to protest sudden movements. Mr. Halbrook took up his position on the stool behind the counter, waiting with the patience of one who has learned that some things cannot be rushed. The visitor looked around the shop, his gaze moving from shelf to shelf, candle to candle, taking in every detail as though committing it to memory. Or perhaps, Mr. Halbrook thought, as though comparing what he saw now to what he remembered from before. "It hasn't changed," the visitor said finally, and there was wonder in his voice. "All these years, and it's exactly as I remember it. The same shelves, the same arrangement, even the smell, beeswax and tallow, and..." He paused, breathing deeply, "and something else. Time, perhaps, or constancy. It's comforting in a world that changes so rapidly." "You've been here before then," Mr. Halbrook said gently, still trying to place the man's face, still searching his memory for the connection he was certain existed. "Oh yes," the visitor said, his eyes now fixed on Mr. Halbrook's face. "Though it's been many years, 60 years in fact, since I last stood in the shop. I was a boy of 9. You would have been, what, 13? 14? Understanding came slowly, like dawn breaking on a cloudy morning. Mr. Halbrook looked more closely at the face before him, trying to see past the lines and years to the features beneath. And then, quite suddenly, he saw it. The shape of the eyes, the particular way the mouth curved when speaking. "William Ashford," he said softly. "Sarah's brother." The visitor, William, smiled, and in that smile, Mr. Halbrook saw the boy he had known 6 decades ago, the younger brother of the girl he had loved and lost. I wasn't certain you would remember me. I was just a child when you knew our family. I remember, Mr. Halbrook said, and found that his voice had grown thick with emotion. You were always underfoot, as I recall, following Sarah and me on our walks, asking questions, making a general nuisance of yourself. William laughed, a sound that held both joy and sorrow. I worshipped you both, you know. You were so grown up, so serious. And Sarah was the kindest person I ever knew. When she died, he paused, collecting himself. Well, it's been 60 years, and I still miss her. As do I, Mr. Halbrook said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, two old men remembering a girl who had been young and vibrant and full of life, whose absence had shaped both their lives in ways large and small. I left York not long after Sarah's death, William said eventually. My parents couldn't bear to stay. Too many memories, too much pain. We moved to Liverpool, and I've lived there ever since. Built a life, raised a family, grew old. He smiled. The usual progression. And what brings you back to York after all these years? Mr. Halbrook asked. My granddaughter's being married here on Saturday, William replied. Her fiancé is from York, and they wanted to be married in the cathedral. I arrived 2 days ago, and I've been walking the old streets, seeing what's changed and what hasn't, and I found myself drawn here, to this shop. I had to see if it was still here, if you were still here. Still here, Mr. Halbrook confirmed. Still making candles, still keeping the same hours. I suppose I've become something of a fixture, like the buildings themselves. There's honor in constancy, William said. The world needs more of it, I think. Halbrook inclined his head in acknowledgement of the compliment. Then, surprising himself, he asked, Would you like some tea? I was just about to make some for myself. William's face brightened. I would like that very much. Mr. Halbrook prepared the tea as he had for Mrs. Ashworth, with the same care, the same attention to small details. When he returned to the shop, William was standing, looking up at the high shelves with an expression of deep concentration. Mr. Halbrook, he said slowly, that candle there, the pale one on the high shelf. May I ask about it? Halbrook felt a small jolt of surprise. He handed William his tea and then looked up at the candle in question. It's been there for many years, he said carefully. Why do you ask? William was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the candle. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverent. Because I remember it, or one very like it. Sarah had a candle. You gave it to her, do you remember? It was for her 17th birthday. You were so nervous wrapping it, presenting it to her. It was pale beeswax, simple and beautiful. She loved it. The memory came flooding back, sharp and clear despite the decades. Yes, he had made a candle for Sarah's 17th birthday, had spent hours on it, making and remaking it until it was perfect, had wrapped it in his best paper, had fumbled through, giving it to her with all the awkward earnestness of a young man in love. She kept it on her windowsill, William continued, his voice distant with memory. She never lit it, said it was too beautiful, too precious. After she died, my mother wanted to light it at her funeral, but we couldn't find it. We searched the house, but it had disappeared. We always wondered what had happened to it. Mr. Halbrook looked up at the candle on the high shelf. Could it be, after all these years? But how? The day before she died, William said quietly, she was feverish, confused. She kept asking for you. My mother finally sent me to fetch you, but you were out making deliveries when I returned without you." Sarah was very upset. She insisted I take the candle, bring it to your shop, leave it for you, she said. He paused, swallowing hard. "She said it belonged with you, that it was always meant to be yours." "I never received it," Mr. Halbrook said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," William said. "I was 9 years old, grieving and confused. I set out to bring it to you, but the streets were icy and I fell. The candle went flying. I was so frightened. I'd broken it, ruined Sarah's last wish. But when I found it, it was perfect, unharmed, as though it couldn't be broken." He turned to look at Mr. Halbrook, and his eyes were wet with tears. "I was going to bring it to you the next day, but that night Sarah died and everything fell apart. We were preparing for the funeral, packing to leave York, drowning in grief, and I forgot about the candle, or I thought I did. But a few years ago, I was sorting through some old boxes, and I found a note I'd written to myself as a child. Bring Edwin's candle to the shop, and I realized I must have brought it. I must have. In those confused days before we left, perhaps I left it by the door or handed it to someone. The memory is gone, but it must have found its way here." Mr. Halbrook looked at the candle. 60 years? Could it truly be the same candle? The one he had made with such care, such hope? The one Sarah had treasured, had sent back to him in her final hours? "It burns," he said softly, "but it never burns down. I've lit it hundreds of times over the years, and it remains unchanged." William nodded slowly. "Love does that, I think. Real love. True love, it endures in ways we can't explain. It burns without consuming. It lights the darkness without surrendering to it." They stood together in silence, two old men contemplating a mystery that was no longer quite so mysterious, a candle that had traveled through death and time and loss to find its way home. "Thank you," Mr. Halbrook said finally, "for telling me, for remembering, for bringing it all those years ago, even if you couldn't remember doing so." "She loved you," William said simply. "She would have wanted you to have it, to have something of her that lasted. And it has lasted, hasn't it? Through all these years, all these seasons, still giving light, still burning." Mr. Halbrook agreed. William finished his tea and set down the cup. "I should go. My family will be wondering where I've gotten to. But I'm glad I came. Glad I saw you again, spoke with you. Glad I could tell you about the candle." "As am I," Mr. Halbrook said. "And William, congratulations on your granddaughter's wedding. I hope it's a beautiful day." "Thank you." William moved toward the door, then paused. "Will you light it, the candle? For the wedding, perhaps? For Sarah?" Mr. Halbrook considered this. Then he nodded. "Yes, I'll light it. For Sarah, for love that endures." William smiled, a beautiful, peaceful smile. She would like that. The bell chimed as he left, and Mr. Halbrook watched through the window as William walked slowly down the street, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the evening. Mr. Halbrook looked up at the candle on the high shelf. Sarah's candle, a gift that had circled back through time, through death, through 60 years of separation to find its way home. He would light it. Not tonight. Tonight he would simply let the knowledge settle, let the story find its place in his heart. But soon, very soon. For now, it was enough to know, enough to understand, enough to feel the presence of a love that had never truly ended, that had burned quietly all these years, waiting to be recognized. Outside, the evening deepened toward night. Inside, the shop glowed with warm light, and on the high shelf, the pale candle stood in its place, no longer quite so mysterious, but no less precious for the knowing. Part 9. Extinguishing the lamps. Saturday came with the promised snow. It began just after dawn, falling in soft, fat flakes that drifted down from a sky the color of pewter. By mid-morning, the streets of York were transformed, the usual browns and grays of winter, giving way to pristine white. The snow-muffled sound, softened edges, turned the familiar world into something gentler, quieter, more dreamlike. Halbrook had watched it fall throughout the day, pausing in his work now and then to look out the window at the accumulation. By afternoon, the snow was several inches deep, and still it fell, patient and persistent. The shop had been quiet. Few people ventured out in such weather, unless necessity demanded it. But Mr. Halbrook didn't mind the solitude. It gave him time to think, to prepare, to ready himself for what he planned to do this evening. The wedding would be taking place at the cathedral even now, he calculated, checking the small clock that sat on his shelf. William Ashford's granddaughter, marrying her York sweetheart in the ancient stone building that had witnessed countless such ceremonies over the centuries. He hoped it was beautiful. He hoped they were happy. And tonight, as he had promised William, he would light the candle. The afternoon faded toward evening, the gray sky darkening by imperceptible degrees. The snow had finally stopped, leaving behind a world transformed, hushed, expectant. Mr. Halbrook completed his final tasks for the day. A few more candles rolled and set aside to harden, his tools cleaned and organized, his workspace made ready for Monday's labor. Then he locked the front door properly, drawing the bolt fully home, turning the sign to closed. His day's work was done. The shop was his alone now, a private space for private purposes. He moved through the shop with deliberate slowness, beginning the evening ritual that had shaped his days for so many years. First, the candles that had been burning through the day needed attention. Some had burned low and required replacing. Others needed their wicks trimmed, their wax pools cleared of debris. He attended to each one with the same care he brought to all his work. The taper in the corner that illuminated his workbench, trimmed and straightened. The pillar candle by the door that welcomed visitors, replaced with a fresh one. The old stub set aside for melting down and reusing. The votives scattered throughout the shop, providing islands of light, each one examined, each one tended. The work was meditative, requiring just enough attention to keep his hands busy, but leaving his mind free to drift. He thought about the conversation with William, about the story of the candle, about Sarah and the life they might have lived together if fate had been kinder. There was sorrow in these thoughts, but it was an old sorrow, worn smooth by time like a river stone. It no longer had sharp edges that could cut. Instead, it had become something he could hold, examine, set down again without injury. Grief, he had learned, eventually transformed into something almost like companionship. The weight of it became familiar, even comforting in its constancy. He finished tending the candles in the shop and moved to the workshop. Here too, candles burned, fewer of them, but each one necessary. The large candle near his workbench that provided light for detailed work. The small votive by the stove that allowed him to monitor the fire. The candle in the corner that illuminated the shelves where he kept his materials. One by one, he trimmed them, checked them, ensured they would burn safely through the evening and into the night if needed. When this was complete, he stood in the center of the workshop and looked around. Everything was in order, tools in their places, wax stored properly, floor swept clean. The workshop reflected the accumulated discipline of a lifetime. Not rigidity, but rather the natural order that emerges when one does the same work in the same place for many years. He returned to the shop and began the process of extinguishing the lamps. He had gas lamps in addition to candles, a concession to modernity made some 15 years ago when the gas lines had been extended to Stonegate. They were useful, he admitted, providing a brighter, more constant light than candles could, but they lacked the warmth, the soul, the gentle beauty of candlelight. He used them during the day when practicality mattered most, but in the evenings, he preferred candles. Now he moved from lamp to lamp, turning the small brass keys that controlled the gas flow, watching as each flame shrank and vanished. The lamps popped and ticked as they cooled, their metal contracting in the evening air. With each lamp extinguished, the shop grew dimmer, more intimate. The candles that remained burning seemed to glow more brightly in contrast, their light more precious for being the only light. He extinguished the lamp by the door, the lamp near the counter, the two lamps that hung from the ceiling, providing overhead illumination. One by one, they went dark, and one by one, the shop transformed. When the last gas lamp was out, Mr. Halbrook paused, allowing his eyes to adjust. The shop was now lit entirely by candles, perhaps 24 of them, scattered throughout the space, creating pools of warm golden light, separated by gentle shadows. This was how the shop had looked when his father ran it, before gas lamps, before the modern conveniences that had slowly crept in. This was how it had looked when he was a boy, learning his trade. This was how it looked in his deepest memories. He moved to the window and looked out at the street. Night had fallen fully now, and the snow-covered cobblestones gleamed faintly in the light from other windows. The street was empty, silent. York had pulled itself indoors, settling in for the night, leaving the winter darkness to itself. Mr. Halbrook closed the curtains, drawing them across the window, shutting out the night and enclosing the shop in its own private world of candlelight and warmth. He moved to the counter and stood there for a moment, gathering his thoughts, steadying himself for what came next. Then he reached up to the high shelf where the pale candle stood. His fingers closed around it, and he lifted it down carefully, reverently. It was lighter than he expected, as though it weighed almost nothing. Or perhaps his hands remembered its weight from 60 years ago, from when he had first made it, first wrapped it, first given it to Sarah with a young man's awkward devotion. He carried it to the counter and set it down gently. In the candlelight, it seemed to glow with an inner luminescence, though of course, it was only reflecting the light around it. Or was it? Mr. Halbrook found he was no longer certain what was real and what was imagination, and he discovered that he didn't particularly care. Some things transcended such distinctions. He had matches on the counter, always within reach. He took one now, struck it against the rough strip on the matchbox, and watched as it flared to life. The flame danced and steadied, and he touched it to the candle's wick. The wick caught immediately, eagerly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The flame grew, strengthened, and then settled into a steady burn. It was a beautiful flame, clear and bright and unwavering. Mr. Halbrook stood watching it, transfixed. The candle cast its light across the counter, across his hands, across his face, and in that light, he felt something shift. Not in the shop. The shop remained as it was, but in himself. Some weight he had been carrying, perhaps for 60 years, perhaps longer, seemed to ease. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly. "I'm sorry I made you wait." The candle burned steadily, silently, its light warm and golden and infinitely gentle. Mr. Halbrook stood there for a long time, watching the flame, remembering a girl with dark hair and eyes that held lights of their own, remembering walks through York streets, conversations that ranged from profound to trivial, plans for a future that never came to be. But also, and this was the gift that William had given him, remembering that Sarah had thought of him at the end, had wanted him to have this candle, this light, this piece of herself that would endure, had sent it to him through her young brother, through time, through all the accumulated years and seasons. The candle had found its way home, and in lighting it, Mr. Halbrook had finally acknowledged what he had always known but never quite admitted, that Sarah's love had endured, that it had burned quietly all these years, waiting not to be forgotten, but to be recognized, celebrated, honored. Outside, the winter night deepened. The snow on the street lay undisturbed, pristine, beautiful. The city slept, or settled into its evening routines, or celebrated the wedding of a young couple who had their whole lives ahead of them. Inside the candlemaker's shop on Stonegate, an old man stood in the warm glow of candlelight, no longer quite so alone, no longer quite so burdened by the weight of time and loss. The candle burned. Sarah's candle, his candle, a gift that had circled through death and returned transformed. Not just an object, but a presence, a comfort, a quiet affirmation that love, true love, endured all things. Mr. Halbrook smiled, and the smile held both sorrow and joy, both loss and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "to Sarah, to William, to the mystery of it all." The flame burned steady and true, and the shop filled with a gentle scent of beeswax and honey. And somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll the hour. Evening had come, night had fallen, and in the small shop on Stonegate, a candle burned that would burn forever, or near enough to make no difference. Part 10. The Last Candle's Glow. The hours passed softly, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the slow burning of candles, the gradual shift of shadows across walls and ceiling, the quiet settling of the building as night deepened around it. Mr. Halbrook had moved his chair from behind the counter to a position facing the window, though the curtains remained drawn. He sat there now, not quite dozing, but not quite fully awake either, existing in that peaceful state between consciousness and sleep, where thoughts drift like clouds and time loses its urgency. Sarah's candle burned on the counter, its flame steady and bright. Mr. Halbrook watched it from his chair, watched the way the light moved, the way the shadows danced, the way the whole shop seemed to breathe in rhythm with the flickering flame. One by one, the other candles in the shop had burned low. Mr. Halbrook had let them. He did not replace them as they guttered and died. Instead, he allowed the shop to grow gradually dimmer, to draw itself inward, to become smaller and more intimate as the pools of light contracted. The votive by the door had been the first to go, its small reservoir of wax exhausted after many hours of burning. The flame had grown smaller, smaller, and then blinked out, leaving a thin trail of smoke that rose and dispersed into the shadows. Then the pillar candle on the middle shelf. One by one, they surrendered their light, each small death, unremarkable, yet somehow significant, like the falling of individual snowflakes, unnoticed in the moment, but contributing to the transformation of the whole. Mr. Halbrook did not stir from his chair. He simply watched, peaceful and patient, as the shop grew darker and quieter and more still. The candle in the workshop was next. He saw its light dim through the doorway, saw the moment when it flickered one final time and went out. The workshop fell into darkness, its tools and shelves and carefully organized materials disappearing into shadow. Now only a handful of candles remained burning in the shop proper. Their combined light was gentle, insufficient to reach the corners or illuminate the higher shelves. The shop had become a place of soft glow and deep shadow, a space that felt both smaller and somehow larger than it did during the day. Smaller because the light reached only so far, larger because the darkness beyond seemed to extend into infinity. Mr. Halbrook shifted slightly in his chair, easing muscles that had grown stiff from sitting. He was not a young man, and his body reminded him of this with increasing frequency. But tonight, the aches and stiffness seemed distant, unimportant. His attention was focused inward, or perhaps beyond himself entirely, to the quality of the moment, the texture of the silence, the way the candlelight made the familiar shop seem like a place half remembered from a dream. Another candle died, and another. The light continued to contract, to draw itself in like a flower closing for the night. The shadows on the walls had taken on a life of their own. They moved slowly, gently, responding to the imperceptible movements of the candle flames, to the small currents of air that flowed through the old building, to forces too subtle to name. They were not threatening, these shadows. They were companions, familiar presences that had shared the shop with Mr. Halbrook for as long as he could remember. He thought, in his dreaming, drifting state, about the nature of shadows. They were not things in themselves, but merely the absence of light. And yet, they possessed character, personality, beauty. A room lit by a single candle had different shadows than a room lit by a dozen candles. The shadows cast by candlelight were different from the shadows cast by gas lamps or electric lights. Softer, more forgiving, more honest, somehow in their gentle obscurity. The clock on the shelf, he could no longer see it, but he knew it was there, struck a late hour. 10, 11, midnight. The number didn't matter. What mattered was that the day had ended, that the work was done, that the shop and its keeper had earned their rest. Only 3 candles still burned now. Besides Sarah's, they formed a triangle of light in the darkness. 1 on the counter to the left of Sarah's candle, 1 on a shelf to the right, 1 on the small table near Mr. Halbrook's chair. He watched them with half-closed eyes, watched their flames waver and dance, watched the light they cast pulse gently like a heartbeat. Time was doing something strange. It was both passing and standing still. Hours might have been minutes. Minutes might have been hours. Past and present seemed to exist simultaneously, overlapping, interpenetrating. Mr. Halbrook was sitting in his shop on a winter night in his 73rd year, and he was also standing at this same counter as a young man, learning from his father. He was also a boy, watching his father work with wide, wondering eyes. He was also ancient, older than the stones of York itself, older than time, eternal as the light he had spent his life creating. The candle nearest to him, the one on the small table, gave a final flicker and went out. The sudden diminishment of light was barely noticeable, yet it changed everything. The shadows deepened. The shop drew further into itself. 2 candles now, beside Sarah's. Mr. Halbrook's breathing had slowed, deepened. His eyes were barely open, just slits through which he perceived the world not as distinct objects, but as patterns of light and dark, moving and still, warm and cool. He thought he heard something, a sound so soft it might have been imagination. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of cloth, but when he tried to focus on it, it faded, or perhaps had never been there at all. The shop held only silence, and the gentle crackling of candles burning, and the occasional settling sound of old wood contracting in the cold. The candle on the shelf gave up its light, the flame shrinking to a point and then vanishing. A whisper of smoke rose and dissipated. 1 candle left now, beside Sarah's. The shop was very dark. The counter where Sarah's candle burned seemed to float in a sea of shadow, an island of light in infinite darkness. Mr. Halbrook could see nothing else clearly. The shelves had disappeared. The walls had receded into invisibility. The ceiling was lost in blackness. There was only the counter, the 2 candles, and the gentle glow they cast. Mr. Halbrook felt sleep approaching now, felt its soft wings settling over him like a blanket. He did not resist. There was no reason to resist. The day was done. The work was complete. Rest was not just earned but necessary. His eyes closed, then opened slightly, then closed again. The last candle, not Sarah's, but the final companion that had been keeping vigil with it, burned lower, lower. Its wax pool deepened. The wick grew long and began to lean, creating an elongated flame that cast strange wavering shadows. And then, with a gentleness that seemed almost courteous, it too went out. Now only Sarah's candle burned. The shop was very still, very quiet. The darkness beyond the small circle of candlelight was complete, absolute. It was not frightening, this darkness. It was restful, peaceful, the darkness of sleep, of night, of the gentle ending of all things, and the quiet beginning of all things that would come after. Sarah's candle burned with a flame that was clear and steady and strong. It cast its light across the counter, across the walls that could no longer be seen, across the shadows that moved in their slow, eternal dance. The flame did not waver, did not gutter, did not show any sign of diminishment. It simply burned as it had burned for 60 years, as it would burn for 60 more, or 600, or forever. A light that endured, a love that did not die. Mr. Halbrook was asleep now, or almost asleep, suspended in that space where dreams and reality blur into one. He felt no cold, no discomfort, only peace, only the warm presence of light in darkness, of constancy in change, of love in loss. The candle burned, time slowed, became like honey, like wax, like something so thick and slow-moving that it was almost not movement at all, but stillness, perfect stillness, the stillness at the heart of all things. The shadows moved, but barely, a slow swaying, like trees in the gentlest breeze. The flame burned, but without consuming. A miracle, or perhaps not a miracle at all, but simply the way things sometimes were, when love was deep enough and true enough and patient. Outside, the city slept. The snow lay pristine on the streets. The stars moved in their ancient courses across the winter sky. Time passed, as it always passed, carrying all things forward toward whatever endings and beginnings awaited them. But here, in the small shop on Stonegate, in the warm glow of a single candle's light, time had found a place to rest, to simply be, to burn without burning out. The candle's flame grew softer, not dimmer but softer, gentler, like a voice dropping to a whisper, softer still. Soft as sleep, soft as snow falling in silence, soft as the last thought before dreams take over completely. The light glowed, warm and golden and infinitely patient, holding back the darkness not through strength, but through simple persistence, through the quiet refusal to surrender, through love. And in that light, an old man slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of summers long past, of a girl with dark hair and bright eyes, of the life they might have lived together. Or perhaps not dreaming at all, perhaps simply resting, content, at peace, held safe in the gentle glow of candlelight and memory and love. The flame burned. The shop was still. Time moved like honey, and the darkness, knowing itself defeated by this small, persistent light, settled down to wait with infinite patience, as it always had, as it always would. The candle burned, and would burn, forever or near enough to make no difference.